Roman Warfare was the first what I might call popular book that I ever wrote. Before that, I'd done The Roman Army at War, but that was based on my doctoral thesis. And when you're writing a thesis, you cover everything in great detail, you put in as many fragments of evidence, as many pieces of information as you possibly can to cover yourself in the hope that your examiners are not going to find any weakness in your ideas, any holes to pick apart. Suddenly, I was confronted after doing that, where it's very much writing for an audience that already knows a great deal about the subject and is familiar with scholarly methods, to writing a coffee table book. Roman Warfare was part of a 24-volume history of warfare edited by John Keegan. And in the volume I was allocated, I had to cover about 1,000 years of Roman military history in 40,000 words. That's not a lot. That's less than half the length of the thesis on which the other book had been based, and that was on a far narrower topic, though in more detail. So it took me about 4 attempts to get a draft down to the right length, and it was a very good learning process because I had to realize that I was talking to a different audience. It wasn't simply other academics, other scholars. This was intended to be a book that anyone who's interested enough to pick it up can follow, can read, can understand, can gain from. But if you already have prior knowledge, hopefully there are some new ideas, some new interpretations, fresh ways of thinking that come in as well. And that really has been the template for everything I've written since then. Some books are longer and more detailed, but they all have that same aim, that if you're interested enough to pick it up, to look at the book in the first place, you can follow it. You don't need prior knowledge, but if you have that, you will also gain as well. So it was a big challenge, and I was a little bit jealous perhaps of those who were writing the volumes. There were about 4 covering the Second World War in one shape or form, instead of one volume covering 1,000 years. But it did mean that you took the overview, you looked at the big picture, and you really followed the development of the Roman state from its earliest days, because its military organization, its warfare, is always integral to what's going on, and you need to understand the politics. It's no coincidence that the Roman word from which we get our emperor is imperator, which means victorious general. All leaders were expected to lead the state in war as well as in peace, at least nominally. Even if many emperors never went near a battlefield, they were responsible for victory and responsible for failure. So we start in the very early days, when Rome was just one small Latin community among many, when its wars were local, close by. There's a story of a 10-year siege of Veii, which is barely 10 miles away from Rome. And they fight the same people generation after generation, but something changes as the Romans start to expand and they turn other communities into other Romans. They have people with Latin status, but also Roman citizens. They spread. The size of Rome as a political community, its citizen body, keeps on increasing. And that's the one thing that marks it out from every other state in the ancient world. But then you come to the better documented period, the era when the Romans finally start to write their own history, really sparked by the great struggle with Carthage. So we have the wars with Pyrrhus, and then the First Punic War, when the Romans create a fleet pretty much from nothing and defeat the traditional sea power of Carthage in a long, arduous, very costly struggle. And then the Second Punic War, the famous time Hannibal brings his elephants and his army over the Alps into Italy. You have this long struggle against a far superior, more tactically sophisticated, more professional army. The key thing is the Romans learn. They absorb appalling casualties, and yet they learn, their armies improve, they get better, and eventually they win. Which takes us into the 2nd century BC and the big expansion of Roman power overseas, the creation of more and more provinces, until the Romans, by the middle of the century, are the dominant power in the entire Mediterranean world. So you've got that, but there are changes to the political system. All this causes stress. A citizen army where everybody serves out of duty, they volunteer, do their time in the army, go back to their farms afterwards or their workshops or wherever they've come from, and then if the state calls them again, they serve again. But it's very much, being in the army is not a career in itself. It's not a profession. It's something that a good, dutiful Roman citizen or Roman ally does. And then they go, they fight as well as they can, they subject themselves to some pretty rigorous discipline, and then they go back home and absorbed into the community. The Roman army in this period is not very visible archaeologically in terms of bases and permanent structures, because it isn't that sort of army. And how it changes into that professional army is one of the big, not too well understood questions of Roman history. And the traditional idea of Marius coming along at the end of the 2nd century BC, suddenly recruiting the poor who were in the past not eligible to serve, and from then on the army is professional, is far too simplistic, isn't really backed up by the evidence. So we have to follow that story through. Look at Julius Caesar's army until it emerges under Caesar Augustus and the creation of the monarchy, the Principate, as the professional army of soldiers serving for 25 years at a time, of big forts, big bases, fortresses, with their amphitheatres, with their bathhouses. The army that sets up inscriptions and monuments of soldiers talking about themselves as soldiers and lives in these permanent bases is very visible archaeologically. It's also probably the Roman army at its peak of sophistication, although the type of wars it's fighting, the military problems are very different. So again, you have to be careful about judging one period to another before you move on to the problems, the frequent civil wars of the 3rd century AD and afterwards, which will change the Roman Empire quite radically in the army with it and lead to the appearance of more than one emperor at a time, then the division of the empire into western and eastern parts that are similar but not politically the same, that have different dynasties, different leaders, different factions at court. The west will collapse, the east will continue. So our 1,000-year saga really ends with trying to answer that big question: why does the west fall apart and yet the east stays strong, even though the east in some ways is facing a more organized opponent in the shape of Sasanian Persia? So it's a great epic story that tells us not just about the wars the Romans fought, the sort of army they had, but the society, the political system at each stage and just how that develops. So in many ways, the story of Roman warfare is the story of Rome itself.